Alrighty. Oh, you know what I didn't do? I typically send a tweet out when these start. Welcome back to Tailosive Tech, live on YouTube, ladies and gentlemen. I was just chatting with my wife, so I was kind of running to the chair as soon as the live stream started. But hope you're all having a fantastic day. 2 days since our last big stream, or no, 3 days. That was on Monday, wasn't it? Since the biggest Mac event ever. I cannot wait for next week. I'm seriously trying not to count down the days, but I'm having a hard time not accidentally doing it mentally. But I am super duper pumped for these new MacBook Pros, but of course that has me thinking a lot now that we've seen kind of the next inevitable chapter of Mac development. We've seen the M1 Pro, we've seen the M1 Max, and we've seen all these redesigns and some ports come back. It certainly has me thinking a lot about the next generation MacBook Air, because that'll be the first time an Apple Silicon Mac likely will get upgraded to a new version of Apple Silicon. So that kind of also tells us quite a bit about the next generation of Mac development, when we see, okay, we've seen what it's like to go from an Intel to an Apple Silicon. Now what it's like to have an update going from Apple Silicon to newer Apple Silicon. It has me thinking a lot, quite a bit actually. So, oh, let me make sure these overlays are good. I'm just very organized. Anyway, that's all set. So I wanted to make the case for a 15-inch MacBook Air. Yes, I've seen some people talking about it in the past. But the main reason I think it actually makes a ton of sense is there is a fairly large gap right now in the current MacBook lineup, if you think about it. Like, MacBook Air starts at $1,000, and then you have... Ooh, seriously, there's always a bug. How does it find me? Anyway, there's the 13-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 chip, which I think is dated and doesn't really serve much purpose in the lineup, in my opinion. Like, clearly Apple is getting rid of ditching the touch bar, right? Like, if the touch bar had a long-term future, they would have included it on the 14-inch and 16 MacBook Pros. Obviously, they didn't, so it's just kind of an obvious matter of time thing that, yes, eventually all the touch bar will be gone entirely, but it's hasn't been updated on the 13-inch M1 MacBook Pro, and I feel like the performance differences between the fanless MacBook Air and the fanned M1 are not that different in the speed tests I've seen, and even in the prolonged, like doing something at high, what do you call it? Not just high capacity, but like prolonged high intensive use of the M1 chip. I still don't notice a huge difference. Oh, thank you, Chenille. We just want a wireless HomePod mini. It's called the iPhone. It gets pretty loud. But yeah, that would be interesting if they made a Bluetooth speaker you could take around with you. Would it? Guess I wouldn't be able to use AirPlay as often, huh? They would have to bring Bluetooth support to the HomePod, which it has Bluetooth, but you can't pair with it via Bluetooth. It's kind of weird. Anyway, yeah, I feel like there's a noticeable gap between, okay, $1,300 starting price for the 13-inch MacBook Pro, and then giant jump to $2,000 for the 14-inch MacBook Pro, with not much in between. And honestly, I feel like that Touch Bar MacBook Pro should go away. We don't need three sizes of the MacBook Pro. I think just having 14-inch and 16-inch is fine. Having 16-inch, 14-inch, and 13-inch, and the 13-inch has way less ports, and the 13-inch doesn't have MagSafe, and it has a touch bar, whereas the other Pros, like, it doesn't fit in. I know they call it MacBook Pro, just like they call the 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pro, but there's so many differences. Maybe they should rebrand the touch bar MacBook Pro to just MacBook or something like that, because it's this, like, awkward middle step between the Air and the Pro. So I think the MacBook Air has a long-term future. That's probably the most popular notebook. You know, that's what most students are buying. That's what colleges buy and that kind of thing. It's like the default entry-level Mac that's technically an all-in-one. You know, we don't typically think of laptops as an all-in-one, but they are. You got your mouse, your keyboard, your battery, your display, all in one device. And going from $1,000 all the way up to $2,000 for the 14-inch MacBook Pro feels like there's something missing there, and I feel like there needs to be some kind of Mac in between the Air and the Pro that sits somewhere close to like $1,400 or $1,500. And in my opinion, you know, some people are saying we should bring back a normal MacBook, which I kind of hate the name of because it forces us to all say regular. With the iPad line, they have iPad and nothing else, but we just call it the budget iPad because it's substantially cheaper. I don't really see Apple bringing back Macs that are like substantially less than $1,000. As much as I want that to happen, I think Apple would rather you just buy an iPad at that point. And they want a Mac to have certain standards with quality and luxury, the way it looks. And the MacBook Air is about as cheap as they're comfortable getting for a all-in-one Mac. Was case pun intended? No, it wasn't. We don't need a high-end and low-end small Pro. Well, I think having different sizes for anything is fine. But in my opinion, what would fit a lot better is a 15-inch MacBook Air. And I'll make the case as to why. That's kind of what I was going for with this stream, but of course the conversation can go in other directions if we so desire. The pitch for it is not just about having a larger display, which I know a lot of people do care about. Many think that 13 inches is too small. And I know a lot of people that have bought 15-inch or now 16-inch MacBook Pros simply because they wanted a larger screen. My wife is a perfect example. She was not doing a ton of video editing or anything performance intensive back when she was in college, but she bought a 15-inch MacBook Pro because she wanted to have the biggest screen possible that she could take around and throw in a bag and take with her, so that you had more flexibility with your windows. So when you're watching movies and stuff, you have plenty of space. You can read a lot more text all at once. So to me, I think that there's a lot of demand for people that are casual users that aren't necessarily pros that would still like a larger display. Kind of a similar story that we're hearing about with the iPhone 14 lineup. It's possible that they might make a max size, like a 6.7-inch iPhone that's not a Pro iPhone. So it doesn't have 120 hertz and it doesn't have a triple camera system with LiDAR, but 6.7 inches, still good battery life, I think, is the other thing we could go for here. So the MacBook Air, like I said in my last video, I was thinking at first if I could combine the 2022 MacBook Air subject with the 15-inch MacBook Air subject, and then I quickly realized that they're like two drastically different topics, so I was like, yeah, I don't think I can stuff all this into one video. It's going to be too long. So I did one video for the M2 MacBook Air, and now I wanted to do a stream and bounce ideas off you guys for the 15-inch MacBook Air, because I actually think because it's not supposed to be a performance junkie machine, it's not meant to be like intense graphics and amazing CPU performance, and we know that this next generation M2 MacBook Air is supposed to be a redesign, ditching the wedge, much thinner, of course, than the MacBook Pro, but still getting MagSafe. If we had a larger version of the MacBook Air, you could take that extra footprint, obviously, because it's going to fit in the 15-inch form factor now, fill all of that extra space basically with battery. Because with the current 16-inch MacBook Pro, you've got a huge thermal system of fans to keep things cool, and it's got to be a tad redesigned with the logic board on the inside to accommodate for the M1 Pro and the M1 Max, which take up a tad more space and need more cooling. Whereas with the MacBook Air, you could kind of bypass a lot of that. And I'm suggesting you could still probably get by with the M2 chip or, M1 equivalent of, entry-level Apple Silicon for the Mac. Because, again, this is not meant to be a machine that's really, really good at, exporting videos and graphics performance. Although M2, I'm sure, will be fine at that for an Air. Having an option that's like, okay, you don't have to spend $2,000 anymore to get or $2,500 to get a display over 13 inches, but you have something with really, really good battery life, because it would be essentially like 100 watt-hour battery, which is like as big as you can make the battery before it becomes illegal to take it on a plane, which is an issue. So Apple wants you to be able to take your laptops on planes. So I don't know if necessarily it would need the full 100 watt hours. That's just what the 16-inch MacBook Pro has. But essentially a much larger battery than the base MacBook Air, but with the same power consumption of the M1. So right now, we're just seeing the M1 and the MacBook Air. Oh my God, these super chats are crazy already. Mitha? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but Mr. Fernando, hey, thank you very much for the super chat. Oh my God, insanely generous. Didn't even ask anything. He just said sup. Wow. That's great. That's crazy. Thank you. Essentially, the battery life on this MacBook, I think, would be the best MacBook battery available. I could see it easily beating out the 16-inch Pro because the power draw from the CPU and GPU would be far, far lower. It's still based on the extremely efficient ARM architecture, but the battery capacity is way bigger than the 13-inch Air. So we already see pretty dang good battery life on the MacBook Air. Fun fact, I believe the 14-inch MacBook Pro has a slightly worse battery life than the M1 MacBook Air when I was comparing the two. So I think it makes a ton of sense. Ben Rayner says, for a casual streamer who makes YouTube videos but not professionally, would you recommend a cheaper MacBook Pro or wait for bigger iMac next year? Well, the waiting game is a tough one because there's always going to be better stuff coming later. I cannot say that enough because I get that question a lot. If you're willing to wait, there will always be there will always be something better, essentially. So it's just a question of how long can you wait? Is your current machine holding you over just fine? Can you get by with your current rig? If you can, I would say it's worth waiting for. But also a lot of people are torn between laptops and desktops, which I would argue makes a huge difference. If you plan on using your machine in one place all the time, a desktop is always going to be substantially better value because it's going to have far more power to draw from. It doesn't have to work off of a battery. It's typically going to age better because you don't have to worry about the battery health getting worse over time. And the other factor is usually with desktops, including a separate keyboard and mouse doesn't cost nearly as much as trying to stuff in a haptic feedback trackpad and a keyboard and all that. So I'm confident that whatever this upgraded 27-inch XDR 120 hertz iMac, I'm going to keep calling it the refreshed iMac Pro, even though that's not, they don't use that name on the website anymore. They've gotten rid of the iMac Pro, but it just makes too much sense to me for them to have a 24-inch iMac, and that's it. And then for the larger size, you go all out with it and give it better dynamic range and high refresh rate. So I'm calling it iMac Pro, but that's going to be, I'm predicting like 2,000, or I'm sure it'll be a tad higher than the current. Like the current 27-inch iMac starts at 1,800, I believe. But of course, when you give something mini LED in promotion, and when you give it the M1 Pro and M1 Max, that's, as we saw with the MacBook Pros, that resulted in a price hike. The 16-inch MacBook Pro only got $100 more, which I thought was interesting, compared to the 14-inch, which got $200 more. And then it actually got cheaper on the higher spec options. So like on the upfront cost, like the cheapest options, it got more expensive, but on the higher end options, they actually improved the value quite a bit, which I was happy to see. But yeah, I think if you're willing to wait for this refreshed iMac, you're going to get much better value, most likely. I don't know when they plan on unveiling it. I think a lot of people have said it's planned for the spring, so a March event, but it also makes sense that because it's a Pro device, they would save it for Dub. So it basically, whenever people ask me that question, I always have to turn it back on them and just be like, so if your current machine is like dying on you, like you can't get your job done, or you need a machine quickly for school or work or something, then don't wait. Don't be hurting yourself by not upgrading. I have known people in my personal life that it's like, okay, just get a new machine. You literally can't do your job with this current Mac. You need to upgrade now. And they're like, well, I want to wait for the next thing though. It's like, that's a financial problem if you can't do your job with the current Mac you have, or the current computer. It doesn't have to be a Mac of any kind. But if you can't afford to wait and your current rig is getting by fine, then I would say wait. If the features of this upcoming iMac sound great and you're not bothered by a chin, there's a good chance this new iMac will still have a chin. I feel like because it's a Pro machine, it will have black bezels, but I don't, Apple surprised me before. Mason said 12-inch MacBook was so awful. I think performance-wise, yes, it was awful, but in terms of just the general aesthetic and the portability, I loved that thing. Don't get me wrong. I reviewed it way back when it came out, and it was like extremely portable, and I could actually, that was the only laptop Apple's ever made, or anybody's ever made that I can recall, that I could type on with my thumbs. To give you some perspective, it's the only only laptop I've ever tried that I can actually hold it like an iPad and just type on the keyboard. That's how small that MacBook was. Like, it's so incredibly light. Yes, the performance was garbage, but I don't think that's what they were going for with that machine. I think the goal was to make something just incredibly lightweight. Basically Apple's version of a Chromebook, a Safari book, if you will. It's like, this is great at being a Mac for Mac things, as in iMessage, Safari, calendar, all the like notes. Like, it's not meant to be a performance driven machine. But now with Apple Silicon, and we've seen how powerful the M1 chip is in the MacBook Air, I feel like bringing back that kind of 12-inch form factor, except with thinner bezels, so you can get it to more of a 13-inch design. I think that kind of makes sense now. Whereas back then, the Intel chips they had available for a fanless laptop were garbage. I know. I tried to edit a video on the 12-inch MacBook. And I was using Adobe Premiere at the time. I think the export for like a 5-minute video took me like 40 minutes or something like that. It was not good. Do you think the M2 MacBook Air will have a price hike? Asks Joe. I think so. Yeah. I feel like it's likely, given mini LED and redesign and totally different chassis and all that. Mac Pro's chip will get the M1 Pro Max. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how they brand that one. I'm curious now that they've given something Max, but there's obviously a bigger chip coming. I got a lot of messages here. How much would a 15-inch MacBook Air cost? I think $1,000 for the 13-inch Air and $1,300 for the 15-inch Air would make the most sense. Well, I see it more so closer to, like, think about how the performance is equivalent on the 14-inch and 16-inch Pro, right? You can, well, there's rumored to be a high performance mode on the 16-inch MacBook, but whatever. There's $500 between those two machines. So I think there's a very noticeable gap, considering I want the Touch Bar MacBook Pro to get killed off. I don't think it needs to exist anymore. It's just too weird. You can get so much of the same thing out of the MacBook Air. So I'm saying get rid of the Touch Bar MacBook Pro, and then there's a big gap, right? $1,000 for a MacBook Air and then $2,000 for a 14-inch MacBook Pro. There needs to be something in the middle, so I'm suggesting around $1,400 maybe, perhaps $1,500 for the MacBook Air 15-inch MacBook Air fanless. I'm still even wondering to myself, like, maybe for the 15-inch MacBook Air they could offer the heavily binned M1 Pro. Not give it the M1 Max. I think that would be too much, but I don't know what the teardowns look like. I don't know how complicated this would be, but if it's at all possible, perhaps bringing the binned, 8-core version, not the 10-core version, but the 8-core version of the M1 Pro into the MacBook Air, and because it's fanless, it has to be underclocked a tad because you can't cool it down as much, whereas the M1 Pro and Max are built to be cooled down in both the 14-inch and 16-inch Pros. So maybe that's too complicated. I don't think it's a requirement for the 15-inch MacBook Air to have a binned version, but basically give it the M2 equivalent, whatever that chip ends up being called, and charge like $1,400, $1,500 for it, and now you can pitch it as, now you can get an affordable laptop with still a giant big display, still with mini LED, while it's still substantially lighter, because I think that's another disadvantage of, like, okay, if you want a laptop over 14 inches, you have to buy this like 5-pound brick that's very thick, and you have to buy it with all the ports and HDMI and SD card slot. And there's a lot of people out there that are like, I'm not going to use my laptop for video editing and graphics editing. I just want a laptop with a big screen and a good battery life. And I think that the 15-inch Air would sell fairly well without cannibalizing much. I still think overall most people opting for the 16-inch MacBook Pro are doing it for the performance benefits, but there's a decent enough market out there that is like, I would be willing to spend more on a MacBook Air if there was a larger size option, but I'm not willing. There's basically, I think, a line of like deal breaker for certain people. I hope that makes sense. My mindset is, there's some people that are like, okay, I'm not going to spend $2,000 on a laptop, but I want a bigger display than 13 inches. And we know this redesigned MacBook Air, even with the thinner bezels and the notch and edge-to-edge keyboard and MagSafe returning, they're going to be like, okay, this is great, but I would like a larger size option, and I would be maybe willing to pay $1,500 or $1,600 for that, but $2,000 is just too much for me. So I think there's a fairly pleasant pleasant and present place for a 15-inch MacBook Air in the lineup. Kind of like how I know the naming is treated differently than iPads, but look at the iPhone lineup, right? We've got the small one and we've got the big one for the iPhone 13. And then you've got 13 Pro, 13 Pro Max, 13 Mini, and the 13. Thank you for the super chat, Alpha. I'll answer that in a second. Intel must be boiling hot with rage. Yeah, I'm sure they are. But no, they're totally going to win Apple back despite mocking them in their advertisements. I think Intel's burning too many bridges to win back Apple at this point. Even if by some miracle Apple couldn't make silicon as fast as Intel, I think they would still end up Apple still wouldn't switch back to them even if they made chips faster. I don't think they will, to be frank, just because Apple's ARM architecture is so efficient and they have so much money being dumped into the development of the Apple silicon. So Guillermo, hope I'm pronouncing that right. Thank you for the super chat. They could have a MacBook Air 12-inch, a MacBook 13-inch and 16-inch, and then the MacBook Pros like we have already. The MacBook could fill in the gap. That sounds too complicated. First of all, I don't think we need a 12-inch MacBook Air. I think that we tried the form factor that with a screen that small and people didn't like it. I don't think that performance-wise there's enough difference in Apple Silicon's lineup to allow for 3 different tiers. Does that make sense? Like with the iPhones, we kind of have our Pro options and then our entry-level options, and then if there's anything cheaper than that, it's basically just an old iPhone. You have an iPhone 11, you have an iPhone 12. I guess they're still selling those. There's just last year's iPhone is cheaper now. Yeah, Intel is literally burning bridges. But what do you do? That's my question for you, Duarte, is like, okay, if the MacBook Air is thin and light and it has M1 or M2 chip in it, what does the regular MacBook have? Like, what is it missing that the Pros have, but the regular MacBook, like, there's not a middle ground chip, basically, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Stevens 288 super chatted, you're still using the iPad mini? If so, did you find a purpose for it yet? I did not, unfortunately. The iPad mini is gone. I really, really appreciated switching back to my iPad Pro as soon as I got it. But yeah, thank you for the super chat, Steven. I could not find a use for the iPad mini. Although I'll admit I really, really tried. I tried to find one and I couldn't. Intel's not going to die. They're clowning on desktop chips, but they still have massive industrial uses. I think I was trying to word that better in the title of not today's video, but the day before. What I was trying to emphasize in the title was that Apple is going to kill Intel from its lineup. I didn't mean kill Intel as in Intel is bankrupt. But I do think that if Intel's not careful, if they're blowing all their money on stupid marketing campaigns and they're falling behind AMD and Apple, they could find themselves in trouble. But, there's a lot of dated businesses that didn't really catch up with the times, but they're still around. IBM is still a thing. Do you think the M2 will be more powerful than the M1 Pro? No. I believe it will be an emphasis on better battery life. I'm sure there's a big enough gap, basically. You can be better than the M1 and not better than the M1 Pro. There's a big enough jump in between there. But let me catch up here. Can't wait for the next Intel commercial. Exactly. Ben Rayner says, I'm comfy with waiting for my desktop is holding up, but that new M chip and the new Macs are appealing. I'm fine waiting for next year. Yeah, I promise you the new iMac will be much better value. You'll probably get a 27-inch ProMotion display, possibly with, Face ID. I think we were talking about that earlier today in the Discord at some point. We were saying, like, it's interesting that they didn't bring Face ID to the MacBooks, but from a technical level, I can understand why. Like, the display lid on the new MacBooks is, like, I think 4 millimeters thin or something like that. And maybe it's not possible to fit a true depth camera system in that. But on an iMac, on the very thinnest one, even if they want to match the thickness of the 24-inch iMac, you'll still have 11 millimeters of thickness, which is quite a bit. Simon says competition is good for us. I always have to correct people with that and say good competition is good. If there's a competitor that doesn't catch up and doesn't beat anybody else and is just overpriced garbage, that's not, you lose all the benefits of competition. I get it. Like if you have two companies that are one-upping each other, you know, you have one company creating something better than Apple, and then Apple creates something better than them, and that's when we benefit because they're both motivated to try harder. Whereas if you have one company that's just so objectively better than the other, and the other company can't catch up, and Apple just keeps beating them and beating them and beating them, that's not the competition that's good for us, because the main idea is that the competition, when it's good, can motivate the other company to try harder. Whereas right now, I feel like Apple's doing so well, they don't probably have that much motivation to do better. They're kind of like, yeah, we're crushing everyone right now. You know, the type of laptops that Apple was comparing the M1 Max to are not laptops that sell in high volume. Like the GPU is garbage when on battery, and the type of PCs that have RTX 3070s and 3080s are so much bulkier and so much bigger. So the fact that Apple's now making machines that can match that and do it on battery, and they don't have to compromise on the size much or the weight much, it's no competition. So Apple doesn't feel threatened, basically. Virgil says, about the 15-inch MacBook Air, is this rumored, or is it something you wanted to put out there? It was rumored earlier this year. Mark Gurman, I think, reported on it in February. They said they were working on a 15-inch MacBook Air, but I think since then they may have reported that the plans have been put on hold or delayed. So it's not a rumor that has come up recently, like, oh, Apple's still working on a 15-inch Air. Like there's a decent chance we won't see one ever, but I'm suggesting that it would be worth looking into, basically. I think it's worth the investment, and if Apple is going to be working on an M2 version of the MacBook Air, I say go for it. Go for multiple options, just like how we have iPad mini, regular iPad, and we've got iPhone 13 and iPhone 13 Pro. You know, the entry level and the Pro models have two size options, and technically the M2 MacBook Air is rumored to be 13 inches, so that's kind of your mini MacBook in a way, because it's smaller than the 14-inch Pro, and then have a larger option with that same thin chassis for people who want the bigger screen and the good battery life. And I think that would end up probably selling really, really well, and I don't think it would cannibalize the sales of the MacBook Pro much. So there's just a noticeable gap in the lineup, in my opinion. In percentage, how certain are you it will come? Well, this is not a leak. I'm not. I don't have sources or anything telling me this is happening. The purpose of this stream, or my pitch, or this case, was to essentially say it's worth looking into. It's not that I've heard a lot of likelihood of it happening. Percentage wise of it happening, I'd say 10%. It's not super likely at this point because I haven't heard much new information. I feel like if they were planning on releasing it next year, we'd be hearing about it from Ross Young around now. Let's see. 12-inch, maybe a MacBook Mini with M1, USB-C, and MagSafe. That's the dream device of mine. I think what you're describing is what I think will essentially be the MacBook Air. Like, if you look at how the 12-inch MacBook design was, that's about as small as you can get a Mac and still keep a decent-sized keyboard, for the record. Like, I'll bring up an image here. The bezels on this thing were not particularly thin, as you can tell. Like, it had fairly thick bezels, but look at the keyboard, right? Like, this keyboard is going right to the edge. So if you start getting a smaller footprint than the 12-inch MacBook, you start having to compromise on the size of the keyboard, which I don't think is what Apple wants. So what I'm suggesting in today's video with the M2 MacBook Air is that it'll be somewhat similar to this in the footprint, but with the bezel thickness of a 14-inch MacBook Pro. So we saw the bezels. Oh, Tushar, thank you for the super chat. I'll read that in a second. We saw the bezels on the new MacBook Pros and how thin they are now all the way around. So thin that they need a notch at the top. If you applied those thin bezels to a form factor like this, you would basically have a 13-inch MacBook Air with the M2, still fanless, but now it'll come in more colors and it'll have MagSafe, and you'll still have your full-size keyboard. So footprint-wise, it's kind of difficult to make a laptop smaller than this without compromising on the size of the keyboard, which I personally don't think is a good idea. They could technically start squishing the shift and caps lock keys down to be smaller, kind of like the 11-inch MacBook Pro keyboard, iPad Pro keyboard. Oh, it's just a super sticker. Well, thanks, man. You didn't say anything, but appreciate it. The smaller chips always get fabbed first. The process worked out at the fab. And then once the defect rate drops, the larger chips will then start manufacturing. So M1, M2, M3 will always be first. I guess that makes sense, yeah. Why do you think Apple kept the 13-inch MacBook Pro? I'm guessing it sells fairly well. I don't think it rightfully does. It's kind of like my my logic with the iPhone 12 Pro. I was like, I don't think people should buy this. It's way too similar to the 12, but there was still a ton of people buying it saying like, yeah, but I want the steel, or I want the LiDAR, or I want telephoto lens. And I was like, I really don't think it's worth the extra money, but people did it anyway. And I think Apple is able to say MacBook Pro starting at $1,300. They like being able to say that. And if they got rid of the Touch Bar MacBook Pro, then now they have to say all MacBook Pros start at $2,000, which is probably not inherently a good look. But I think there's a lot of people that are like, I'm a pro. I want, a more higher end Mac. There's just a certain amount of stigma attached to the MacBook Air mentality. People think, oh, there's no fans in it. That's not powerful. That's just a light, crappy laptop with crappy specs. So I see the term pro, and that means it's faster. That means it's better. Oh, hey, Daniel. Wow. Thank you for the super chat. That was nice of you. I'll read that in a second. So, yeah, kind of like what Michael is saying. People see the word pro for $200 more and think I want that because they're like, I'm getting a beefier, stronger laptop. Even though, in reality, from the speed tests I've seen, the difference between M1 in the Air and M1 in the Pro, not that big. I know this because I didn't try out the M1 MacBook Pro, but I did review the 24-inch iMac, which had the M1 chip and 2 fans, and I did not notice any substantial difference in my export times between the two machines. In fact, if anything, the 24-inch iMac was slightly slower, which doesn't make sense. But I've seen lots of comparisons where it's like, okay, when you use the fan, it's like 2 seconds faster at this one thing. It's like I don't see a night and day difference between those two chips. So the reality of the situation truly is that the M1 MacBook Air is pretty dang powerful for what it is. For a fanless laptop, nothing comes close. I don't think anything is close to the performance of that for the money. The fact that you can get a refurbished M1 MacBook Air for $850, and that thing literally does not have fans. The battery life is amazing. For most people, I think that laptop is perfect. Like, the only people who should be paying for the M1 Pro or M1 Max are... Wow, thank you, Jonathan. We got some super chats coming in. I got to catch up. But essentially, I think most of the only people in my mind that can justify getting the M1 MacBook Pro, like Nick from the Tech Podcast, are people that are just diehard Touch Bar fans. I understand that. They're out there. But whenever we talk to Nick on the podcast about the M1 MacBook Pro, he's like, it has the Touch Bar. I love the Touch Bar. The Touch Bar is so good. And I'm like, okay, I guess you can't get that elsewhere, but in my opinion, like, you shouldn't be buying that MacBook because you think the performance is substantially better, because it's not. To me, it's not. It's definitely not $200 or $300 better, and you'd be better off just getting a higher storage configuration on your Air for the same amount of money. Anyway, Daniel, he says, I'm stuck on a decision between a 14-inch M1 Pro, between the 8-core and the 10-core, and the 10-core with the 16-core GPU. What do you recommend for light work and maybe some 3D printing software? Just the fact that you said light work, that instantly makes me want you to get the 8-core, because I know that there's pretty much a mindset for a lot of people that it's a binned CPU, right? That means that there's certain cores on it that aren't activated. It kind of makes people feel bad that you're like getting a hand-me-down chip because there's so much, mass production going on with the M1 Pro and M1 Max that sometimes they don't have great yields on some of those chips, so they just sell those chips on lower-end Macs. But I think people still are misunderstanding. The M1 Pro, even in its 8-core configuration, is still a beast. Like the M1 is insanely powerful, and this is going to be, even with the 8-core option, that's 6 high-performance cores, and on that base option, a 14-core GPU. That's still a lot. So just the fact that you even considered saying, I do some light work, I think the base M1 Pro will be fine for you, and you should save that money. I don't know much about 3D printing software, but I don't personally think that the 14-core GPU and the 16-core GPU for what you're planning on using it for is going to make that big an impact. I'm still slightly regretting getting the M1 Max, but the more I read about it, the more I'm reaffirming my decision, because it's going to take me a while to order a new MacBook Pro if I decide to just settle for the M1 Pro instead of the Max, because I realized after I had ordered it, like, okay, the CPU is the same on both, and the CPU impacts the export times the most. But then I, of course, had more people commenting and texting me saying, Drew, the M1 Max has 2 ProRes encoders and decoders, so that helps with export times. And now we're finding out this morning that just the 16-inch MacBook Pro with M1 Max, no other MacBook, but if you get an M1 Max in the 16-inch option, there is like a high-performance mode which you can activate, which I don't think software-wise is that complicated. All it really is probably the fans revving up extra high so that the CPU and GPU can run at a high clock speed for a longer period of time. So now I'm like, okay, I wouldn't have been able to got that if I had the M1 Pro. So I'm slowly convincing myself that M1 Max was a good decision, but you're not Daniel, you're not debating if you should get M1 Pro or M1 Max. You're debating between 2 separate M1 Pros, and I think if you're on the table, if you're on the fence, you'll probably be fine going with the cheaper one. Let's see. Don't forget to give them the stupid $20 for the fast charger like I did. I don't know. I personally have not been in a ton of situations. Granted, I haven't used a MacBook in a long time. But I haven't been in a ton of situations where I needed to fast charge a laptop. I'll be honest. Like, I feel like a lot of laptops are used at a desk. You know, you take them in your bag, or you use them on the couch, and you're near a wall outlet and you're charging it, and then you unplug it. But I don't know. I feel like not so much with laptops, maybe more so with phones. People are like, oh crap, I forgot to charge. Like, are people in a scenario where they need to quickly charge their MacBook and then leave the charger and get along with the day? I could be wrong, but I think that people are more likely to take their laptop charger with them than their phone charger. Is that safe to assume? Like, I know a lot of people that just charge their phone at home, and then, you know, sometimes or whatever, they forget to charge it one night, so they want to charge it up in the morning as quickly as they can because they're going to disconnect and then take their phone with them for the rest of their day. Whereas with a MacBook, you're most likely going to be using it in an environment where you have access to power, right? Like, maybe sometimes you edit or do stuff with it on the go, but for the most part, you're going to be in a classroom, which probably has access to a wall outlet, or you're at the campus center at your college and they have chargers, or you take it to Starbucks and they have chargers there. And that, so fast charging, while it is convenient, people should remember that it does impact the battery health in the long term. It's an objective thing. Like, you charge the battery faster, it will heat up the battery more, and that will degrade it quicker. So I kind of would have opted personally, even if there wasn't a price cut or anything, I would have opted for a cheaper charger that didn't fast charge my MacBook. If it would, not a cheaper, sorry, a slower charger, even without a price cut, if it meant my MacBook battery health would be preserved longer. Because I do plan on using this next generation MacBook I'm getting on Tuesday for at least like 4 to 5 years. Similar to the iMac Pro, which I've been using for almost 4 years now. Like, I don't plan on replacing this in a year or 2 years or anything. Like, I want to hold on to it for the long haul. So the more I can preserve the battery health, the better. Interestingly, the 16-inch can fast charge over USB-C, but there are no compatible USB-C cables yet. It needs a USB-C cable with PD 3.1 rated for up to 200 watts. Well, that's interesting. That makes me want to charge it over Type-C so that it doesn't go as fast. Fast charging would be helpful for travelers at coffee shops, hotel, airport, and bus stops. Here's the thing. I think the battery life is so good you won't need to. unless you are like continuously 3D modeling between coffee shops, hotel, and airport. But I don't know, maybe some people are doing that, but between flights, don't most planes have chargers on them? I don't fly a lot, but the last like 2 flights I've been on, there's been outlets you can plug into for your laptops. Okay, sorry, there was another super chat here. Daniel's super chatting again, so I really got to catch up. Sorry, Jonathan Kane says, thinking about 16-inch Pro, my concern is if I plug it in daily working from a dock, how long realistic battery degradation, 3 years to 5 years? I'm pretty sure that Apple is fairly creative with pulling all of its power from the wall if your battery is fine. If your battery is full, it won't pull the energy from the battery. At least that's what it used to be. I'm not sure if they've changed it since then, but I think they have optimized battery charging in macOS now. I have a hard time knowing because I don't have a MacBook currently. I just use my iMac Pro, so obviously it doesn't have that feature. But I think they're kind of designed for that. That they're kind of designed to preserve battery health in the long run, even if you plan on using it docked most of the time. So I wouldn't worry about that. I think it'll be fine. But thank you for the super chat, Jonathan. Seriously, this is helping me afford my super duper expensive Mac. Thank you. Okay, so Daniel said, thank you for the help. By the way, I plan on using it until next new redesign. How do you think it will hold up based on this design? Oh, based on this, does your recommendation change? No, I think if you're planning on holding on to it for the long haul, I still think M1 Pro, even the binned option, will be plenty for what you need. Obviously, if you want to spend the extra for that slight longevity, it's up to you. It's your money. But I think Apple kind of went all out with these MacBooks, to be honest with you. This is giving me 2018 iPad Pro vibes, partly because I'm looking right at one here. But kind of similarly, like Apple released this thing in 2018, and I felt like none of the iPad upgrades since this have really justified the money. Like there's been nice upgrades. Like I appreciate the A12Z and the M1, and I appreciate Center Stage and Mini LED, but there's still inherently like nothing really wrong with the 2018 Pro. And I'm like, I'm over 3 years now. I've owned this iPad for over 3 years, and there isn't really any groundbreaking feature that's come out with the new iPad Pros that's made me go, oh, I really need to upgrade for that. Like you can't top it, and it's going to be very, very difficult to top it to get to the point where I'm like, okay, now I need a new iPad, because I think iPad OS is partly to blame. Like don't have much software to take advantage of the M1 chip on an iPad, and Mini LED is cool, but there's not much software to take advantage of that extreme dynamic range. And I've already got Type-C, I've already got 120 hertz, I got great speakers, I've already got Face ID. So there's obviously things for Apple to improve with future generations on the MacBook Pro, but I think they're fairly small things. Like, yeah, I agree. Like Face ID was an obvious one, and I think they could do that later. Center Stage would be nice, or HDMI 2.1 would be nice. Little things like that, but I feel like, well, those are inevitable to a certain extent. Like, of course, that's going to happen at a certain point, but I'm visualizing that happening in the future. And of course, the chips will get better. We'll get M2 Pro and M2 Max. That's almost a given at this point. I don't want to say confirmed, but yeah, of course, Apple Silicon will get better. It will get more power efficient. We know that. That's something we, honestly, you're not really supposed to take things for granted, but that's something we kind of take for granted. Like, yes, computers and laptops will get faster, will get better over time. But I don't see myself wanting to upgrade my 16-inch MacBook Pro just for Face ID or just for Center Stage. Like, yes, I appreciate those features and I want them to exist, but I don't see a point in upgrading my whole Mac over that. And I cannot compare, like, in all my years of watching Apple, I've never seen them make such like a crowd pleaser product. I know some people are being picky about the notch and whatever, but that's it. Like, that's all we've got. I mean, there's so many people overwhelmed and so happy with the legacy ports. Like, honestly, what didn't they change with these new MacBook Pros? That's what's kind of blowing my mind. The display got upgraded. The camera got upgraded. The specs got upgraded. The design got upgraded. The keyboard got upgraded. The only things that didn't change is probably Touch ID and the trackpad. But the speakers were upgraded. The battery life was upgraded. The microphones were upgraded. Like, the Thunderbolt ports were up to Thunderbolt 4. The I/O was updated, you know? Like, the chargers that they come with are updated. The charging speed is upgraded. And they brought back, like, it's this whole clash of, like, what was old is now new again, but you're getting the best of the best performance available. So that's why I'm kind of willing to go all out with this model, and I'm willing to spend an unhealthy amount of money on this MacBook, because it's like, I know there will probably never be an upgrade like this again for a long time. Like, I can't fathom what Apple's going to do. They might, like, what is the next redesign for this thing? Maybe they make it thinner. I guess the design is kind of thick and heavy. Yeah, the price was updated. So I'm getting, for the same vibe that we got, like, iPhone 10, like, when I reviewed that phone, I was like, there will never be this many upgrades in an iPhone upgrade ever again. I still stand by that point. Like, in terms of noticeable improvements, there's been techie improvements that I care about. You know, 13 Pro Max. I'm a diehard 120 hertz fan, so I'm like, yeah, of course, that's a noticeable upgrade, and I appreciate that. And the notch getting a tad smaller, some people care about that, not me. But cinematic mode is kind of cool, but the average consumer doesn't care about it. So the iPhone is getting more and more catering towards, like, the only way we can make this better is if we cater to the tech specs. If we start giving it things like ProRes and we start giving it things like ProMotion, those are things that the tech community cares about. But that's kind of a sign of what happens when you run out of average consumer features, which I don't think are as exciting, because all they've got going for them now on the 13 mini and 13 is like, well, the battery life's better. Maybe someone wants to try cinematic mode, but I'll be honest, I've shown that to several people, and they're always like, wow, that's cool, but they've never been like, whoa, I need that phone. You know, it's not like an upgrade worthy feature for most people. So yeah, I think that in the Mac department, at least, there will never be this many, like, year over year upgrades ever again in a long, long time. I can't fathom one. Like, what would they do that would be as big a deal? Maybe if they did something crazy and did, like, a whole virtual, you know, keyboard on the bottom, but they got rid of the touch bar, so that's not likely to happen. This is a new generation of MacBooks. Probably not much will change in the next 5 years or longer. Yeah, it's a good question. Like, what would be a bigger upgrade than this? The question I keep playing back in my head that I'd love to hear your guys' opinion on is, okay, so Apple ditched HDMI, and they ditched MagSafe, and they ditched the SD card slot, and now they've brought them all back. When do they remove them again? Now that they're back, are they here to stay for like a decade? Or do we reach another point in history where Apple decides, actually, I think we are done now with HDMI and SD card slots? Like, are we ever going to go back to the point where it's just Thunderbolt? I mean, it's easy to say in the short term, no, they're not going to go back to it in the next 3 years or 4 years. Okay, that's fine. I could believe that. But the next 20? I don't know. The next 20 years, I have a harder time believing. They'll take them out when it gets thinner. Yeah. And then people will get mad. So then they wait 5 years and then they bring them back again. Okay. Alpha says, How has Touch ID been when you had your psoriasis? I'm scared because I have eczema and generally struggle with fingerprint scanners. Yeah, Touch ID was fairly useless to me when I had pretty bad psoriasis side effects. I still technically have psoriasis. It's a genetic disorder, but the medication I'm taking has basically gotten rid of all the flakiness. So Touch ID works fine for me now. Now I'm getting Intel commercials in my head with the virtual keyboard comment. Yeah. Scott says HDMI should not have been brought back. I don't think it's that bad an idea, because as long as Apple's not making their own standalone monitor, I'm going to probably use it with external monitors. I would have preferred it if it was HDMI 2.1, but it's fine. Like I know a lot of people that are probably going to use it with 4K at 60 monitors, or the use case I kept seeing brought up with a lot of people is like, I either have a job or I go to college or I have a high school where I bring my laptop in and then I want to connect it to the projector screen to do the presentation or to show the video, and having to carry around an adapter or a dongle just so that I can plug it in via HDMI got annoying. So the way I see it is like, okay, I may oftentimes use my MacBook docked at my desk, and I may or may not. I'm not sure if I will. I can't really find one I love yet, but I might get an external monitor, preferably a high refresh rate one to go with it. So if I get a 1440p 144 hertz monitor, I can connect to that via HDMI, and I can power the MacBook through MagSafe 3. So now I'm getting power and video output, and I still have 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports left and an SD card slot, so I don't even need to plug in an adapter for the SD card. So that's a lot of vacant Thunderbolt access, despite having a lot of stuff already plugged in and docked. So I don't see it as a downgrade personally, but I understand a lot of people are done with those ports, but it's very easy in my mind to just be like, well, just don't use them if you don't want them. I have a friend who hated the last generation of MacBook Pros to the point where he doesn't acknowledge their existence. Naturally, he loves the new MacBook Pros. My father-in-law texted me about the new MacBooks. That's how big a deal these were. I think a lot of average consumers even were like, whoa, Apple brought back legacy ports? That's crazy. High refresh does not work on HDMI 2. It doesn't at a certain resolution. So on HDMI 2, you cannot do 4K at 144 hertz, but you can do 1440p at 144 hertz. So, yeah, I guess if you find a 144 hertz monitor that's 4K, you got to use the Thunderbolt port, which it has, and then your HDMI port becomes a little useless, but I should have said it shouldn't have replaced a C port. Replacing a variable port with an invariable port is what annoys me. The thing is, they're not replacing it with one port, though. I feel like what was smart about how Apple did it was they realized that probably 95 to 99% of the time, one of those 4 Thunderbolt ports was always occupied by an adapter that was providing power, an SD card slot, and HDMI. I bet that was the ports that people were using on dongles for like 95% of things. So the fact that they ditched one Thunderbolt port, but they replaced it with the most commonly used ports in our adapter makes life easier, because now there's one less dongle that you don't have to pack around with you. There's one less adapter. Probably the other 5% or the other more common thing is USB-A. I'm glad that didn't come back, but there's still a lot of accessories that are USB-A, so that's probably something people keep using. Let's see. How many monitors will you use at once? Probably just an external monitor and the MacBook monitor. I used to do like 3 monitors, and it was kind of pointless. I kept trying to like come up with things to put on the third screen, and I didn't end up using much. But after Ross Young kind of got me slightly excited there for a minute. He said that Apple was working on like a 120 hertz mini LED standalone monitor, and then he corrected himself a few hours later, and he was like, actually, it's an iMac. And I was like, okay, but just that thought process made me think maybe Apple wants to do a standalone monitor again, and that made me want to wait and not jump on a cheapo 144 hertz monitor from Amazon. But what is funny is that if you use the Pro Display XDR with these new MacBook Pros, the HDMI port is useless, because you can't use HDMI with the... My Google speaker just keeps going off for no reason. It's so confusing. Ugh. Do you have a 120 hertz monitor? I used to, and then I gave it to a friend, and I think that friend doesn't really have it anymore. Sunny Patel says, just talking about it makes me so hyped for Tuesday. Yeah, I can't stop thinking about it. I think that Apple was expecting the rest of the industry to follow with only providing USB-C. Didn't work. Yeah, I think they made a prediction that the world was moving in a certain direction, and yeah, it didn't go that way. Yeah, this dang bug. What happened? It's probably the same bug as yesterday. With iPad Almost got him. With iPad via sidecar, you can have 3 displays. Well, with the M1 Pro, you can easily do more. Let me scroll up here. How many monitor? Oh, I read that. Sorry. Probably just 1 or 2. I'm actually going to see if I can just get by with the display on the MacBook Pro. That'd be interesting. Read up here. 2018 iPad Pro is the peak iPad upgrade. I'm still using mine, and I intend to keep it until it stops getting software updates, which is going to be a while. It is. I agree. Like, the fact that I'm 3 years into my iPad Pro ownership experience, and I have no clue how close I am to upgrading it. Like, I could easily see myself still using this for another 3 years. That says a lot about how major of an upgrade that was, because everything they've added to it since has been like, okay, kind of nifty, but I don't need to spend more money to get that. Ace Rocks Tech, I don't know if you're still watching, but earlier he asked, what MacBook did I order? Basically a maxed out MacBook Pro other than the RAM. The main reason I didn't get 64 gigs of RAM is because I've never had RAM issues on my iMac Pro, which has 32 gigs of non-unified memory. This new RAM is unified memory. And it doesn't make a difference to me. For my workflow, the extra RAM doesn't matter. Doesn't help at all. But storage I do use a ton of. Just a lot of footage I download and a lot of things I record constantly. I'm doing 2 to 3 podcasts a week, which all take up storage space, and I'm recording 2 to 3 videos a day. And I don't keep all my B-roll footage, but I do keep some B-roll accessible for cutaways, more so on EV than tech. But basically do lots of vlogs, and we're editing comedy skits, and I will use the full 8 terabytes. It's just a matter of time. And because I'm holding on to this MacBook for many, many years, essentially the larger storage option I get, the longer it will last without me having to buy external drives. And I want local storage because I don't want to have to pack more external drives with me. I'm planning on traveling more and taking more trips in the future, so I don't want to NAS because that doesn't really solve the problem. So I was happy to spend the extra money on the 8 terabytes because that does make a difference for me, but the RAM does not. Hey, Brett, welcome. Can you make Red Komodo skits for Tailosive TV? That's going on, RV. It's happening. We're filming more on Saturday if things go according to plan, but it's hard to get people arranged. Like, I'll be honest. I see you, RV. You're always there asking about Tailosive TV, but I have a soft spot in my heart for that channel because that was the first Tailosive channel, and I want to do more with that, but it is challenging to get people available. Everyone's got lives and everyone's got things going on, and trying to find times where everybody is free and that we can all get together. It's tricky. I'm trying. Got the AirPods 3 on the way. Really wish I could afford just the base model MacBook Pro right now. I'll get it at some point. Wait for certified refurbished. I'm sure it'll get cheaper. Martin Gel says, I think pro users is the type of market that are resistant to change, hence why Apple can get away with removing headphone jack on the iPhone, but not the legacy ports on the Macs. Yeah, I think that's part of it. I also think that it's incredibly ambitious how many things the Thunderbolt port is trying to replace all at once. And I also think Apple honestly could have tried harder. Like, I kind of understand the sentiment of a lot of you guys saying, like, I want as many Thunderbolt ports as possible, and I don't like that they got rid of one, and I want 4 or more than that if possible. So I understand that, but I would feel better if Apple like was trying to provide direct alternatives a bit more. Like, I would have really appreciated Apple kind of opening up AirDrop to third parties. I think that would have made a big difference if you could actually have professional grade Canon or Red or Blackmagic cameras where from their software you could AirDrop files to the Mac. Then I'd be like, okay, we don't need SD cards anymore. But Apple never really found anything like that. So we were just resorted to using adapters and dongles or having to plug in straight through USB-C. But that's not always practical because, similar to my workflow, you know, we oftentimes keep our cameras attached to our mounts and to our tripods, so we can't always haul our whole camera over to our editing station. Most of the time we want to be able to just pop out a card and bring it over to the editing rig, Or with certain YouTube groups, they'll film stuff with like 8 to 10 cameras. So the complication of getting all that footage together, trying to airdrop it or take all the cameras off and plug them in via USB-C to our Mac, it isn't practical. It makes far more sense to have a tiny, small SSD of some kind that can fit in the camera, and then you can pull it out and leave the camera attached to the mount it's on or the tripod, take it over to your editing rig. That's just more practical. So I'm glad they included SD, but yeah, like, because Apple's not trying that hard to provide an alternative to SD cards or anything, it's like, yeah, you might as well bring it back if you're not going to tell people what they should do. You have the HDMI port and MagSafe, so between that, most people won't lose out. I have an additional Thunderbolt hub that I can use for it as well. Yeah, I'm sure most of us have our hubs by now. Now MacBook users will want CFast readers and red Mini-Mac readers. Luckily, the red Komodo shoots straight to CFast cards, so I feel like that might be a common enough standard, but no, there's so many. There's so many different versions of SD and CFast and mini mags, like you said. It's it's going to be impossible to have a port for everybody. What do you think about getting Apple Care on a Mac? I don't do it personally, just because I've never had an issue where it was like, man, this could have been solved if I had Apple Care, but I didn't buy it. It always seems to be a way to spend a bunch of money on something that you might not use. You know, there are certain things in life that require insurance, and there are certain things that don't. But I've had very reliable experience with all my Macs. I haven't bought Apple Care on anything in my whole life, and I've never had an issue. Typically, if there is a problem, it's within warranty. So like with AirPods getting quieter or something, I can get a replacement for free, or my keyboard got messed up once on my iMac Pro, so I brought it to Apple and they replaced it for free. So yeah, I've had good experience even without Apple Care. But a lot of people seem to think it's a good idea. If you're more clumsy with your tech and you're more prone to dropping it or breaking it, then it's probably a good idea. But I baby all my tech. I'm very careful. I'm very aware of like where I am, and when I'm in a situation where I'm like, okay, you're on concrete now, don't drop your phone, or I'm on carpet now, it doesn't matter as much. So, I don't use screen protectors, I don't use cases, and I've never had an issue. So, do you think they'll bring back the MacBook and discontinue the MacBook Air to simplify their lineup? No, I don't think that would simplify things, because then you would have to refer to the MacBook as the regular one or the non-Pro MacBook. Just saying MacBook isn't precise enough. They got rid of the 12-inch MacBook, I think, for that reason. It wasn't really recognizable or identifiable, whereas MacBook Air, people know that name. It's iconic. It's like, I'm aware of that brand. Same thing as iPhone. You could argue like it would be simpler if we had Apple Watch and Apple Phone, but iPhone is way too iconic. What piece of content would you say is the easiest to make? Live streaming, probably. I mean, podcasting too. The thing is, I'm not super passionate about editing. I mean, I have to do a lot of it for my job, but I always thought that the video making experience is the most fun if you skip the editing process. Like if you write everything and film everything and then hand it off to someone else to edit, that will make it the most exciting. Editing is basically fixing everything. It's like, making the video happen and getting it all arranged. So live streaming, you don't have to edit. You just go live and you get to interact with, people, and you get to pitch ideas and hear your guys' ideas. So this is very, very easy for me, which is why I enjoy it. But a lot of people don't have the time for live streams or don't like the format. So that's what edited videos are for, and those obviously do a lot better view-wise. But how long does it take to edit a video? Usually, I mean, obviously it depends on the length of the video, but usually for me it's like an hour. Once you've got the video filmed and you're editing it, it's not that hard. The trickier part is figuring out what to talk about, getting an idea, finding a subject that you can expand on and talk enough about. But the editing process is usually around an hour for me, but then it takes time to export and whatever. Let's see. Still waiting for the day Apple releases Touch ID for the Pro phones just to unlock easier with wearing masks. Just get an Apple Watch. It's a lot cheaper than buying a new phone. It'll unlock when you wear a mask. Can I ask a question that I think I missed the answer to? What Tesla did Nick end up buying? He didn't buy one. I think he's waiting a bit longer. Are you still open for collabs? I'm not against collabs. My time is so booked up. I'm trying to do things I'm passionate about, like, make time for podcasts and vlogs, and of course trying to make time to hang out with my wife and my friends, but also trying to make this Tailosive TV series happen, and also working on tech and EV. It's like I don't have time to do the things I want to do, so it's kind of difficult to make time for things other people want to do. Why does Apple seem to think that only power users want bigger screens? I think there's a tad bit of correlation, maybe not necessarily causation, but the other thing is the display often ends up being one of the most expensive parts of a device, whether it's an iPad, a Mac, or a phone. The display panel typically ends up being a lot, so it's not so easy to just take out the performance and leave the big display and have the price drop a lot. So, I made the case for the 15-inch MacBook Air at the beginning of the stream. It's possible the reason they haven't done it is because, okay, even if we ripped out the fans and we ripped out the extra ports, the legacy ports and the extra Thunderbolt ports, and we ripped out the M1 Max of the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and we just put in an M1 and a battery, some crappy speakers, some crappy microphones, we just called it a day, it would still basically be like $2,000. So Apple would be like, okay, that's still too much. So we can't really justify selling that. That could be one of the reasons they don't do it. Let's see. Will the Mac Pro Tower be the last of the user upgradable options, or will they carry that over to the new Pro Tower when transition is complete? The truth is, when you do a whole system on chip, you can't make things very upgradable, because you kind of have your SSD, your RAM, your CPU all put together. So there's not a whole lot you can just pop out. It's not like a card. It's not like a drive or something that slips into a socket on a logic board. It's like, yep, everything's right there. It's on this tiny little piece of silicon. That's like most of the whole machine. You referenced the third podcast. What other podcast do you do? I'm working with Model Y Mike from Tailosive EV on Tailosive movie reviews. So we're trying to go through the Spider-Man series right now, because we're basically going to rewatch all the Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield Spider-Man and the Tom Holland Spider-Man before No Way Home comes out, so that we're all kind of refreshed on the Spider-Verse, basically. So I'm making time for that too. Do you think we will see issues with cooling on the 14-inch MacBook Pro? I've seen several people comment on the weight difference on the 16-inch Pro versus Max, and having bought the 14-inch, wondering if this is a possible issue. With an ARM architecture, I wouldn't worry that much about it. Like, the 24-inch iMac, I think, is the only M1 machine with two fans, and those things like never revved up for me. So I think you can essentially achieve its max performance numbers for not, and it won't get that much hot. Basically, I think the overheating issue is an Intel age problem. Basically, the fact that you can put an M1 in a fanless design and it's still super duper fast says a lot about the M1 Pro. I don't think you're going to easily be able to get to the point where it's too hot, so it needs to be underclocked. I think that's an Intel problem. That's an x86 issue. That's not really as much of a thing. I wish I could do more talk streams. I just don't have the time. And most of the time when I was doing Tailosive Talks Q&A streams, they just kind of fell into tech subjects anyway. So I was like, well, why don't we just stream on Tailosive Tech? So that's why we're here. I think the SSD may remain upgradable on the Mac Pro, but the RAM will no longer be upgradable once the Apple Silicon transition comes to it. You technically could add some, PCIe-based slots to the upcoming Mac Pro, but they won't be as fast as the silicon that's built into the system on chip architecture. So you could add SSDs, but it's kind of the same concept of like, yeah, you can plug in an external drive to the new M1 Pro MacBooks. It's slower, but you can do it. um, so yeah, I don't think modularity is going to be a big piece of computers in the future. I think that as you get, Marquez touched on this at one point. I can't remember when, if it was a podcast or a video or something, but essentially when you do these more, thank you, Ben, for the super chat. Thank you. When you have these whole system on chip designs where you make an architecture far more efficient by bringing all of the components of the computer closer together, the CPU, the GPU, the RAM, everything's all kind of intertwined, you get these amazing metrics. You get super low power consumption, which means great battery life and still great performance because it's an efficient architecture, but everything is so close together, doesn't really leave much room for you to go in there and rip things apart and replace things. So honestly, that's what I think a lot of the future is. You know, some people may disagree, but I think a lot of the future is like, okay, the chip is faster than anything you could have built with x86, and it consumes a fraction of the power of anything that's running x86, but you can't upgrade it. So the result is, do you want a slower upgradable machine or a faster non-upgradable machine? What do you think most people are going to pick? And it's like, I could upgrade it to be just as fast. Nah, it's going to consume more power. And by the time there's, cheaper versions of that upgradable hardware, there will be cheaper versions of that ARM architecture that's more close together and just results in there being less upgradability. I think M1 Pro and M1 Max has shown us a lot now that, like, okay, you can start actually matching graphics performance of the RTX 3070 or 3080 on an integrated GPU. And this is within like the first year of Apple Silicon being out. Imagine what it's going to be in another couple of years. It'll probably, at this rate, with the rate of acceleration of ARM architecture getting faster and faster and more efficient, and ARM v9 coming later, it's probably going to surpass discrete GPUs eventually. And this, keep in mind, M1 Max performance is all being done with a battery life in mind. When Apple's designing silicon for the Mac Pro, they don't have to worry about power consumption much there. They can consume a lot more energy. Okay, Ben says, I have a question. If it's too personal, you don't have to answer, but how did you, Randy, and Nick meet each other? You all seem to be great friends. Basically, like this. You wild and bro, thank you. That'll be the last super chat I answer. But basically, I was doing lots of live streaming, and I was making tech videos in the attic, and Nick was a fan, and I believe Randy was as well. He was watching my videos because they were both into Apple, and I was into Apple. And Nick reached out to me and said, I think podcasts are becoming more and more popular. I think a lot of people want a way to like listen to your thoughts on subjects in the background. And he just like you, Ben, was like super chatting in streams and stuff. And he was just like, hey, you should do a Tailosive Tech podcast or something. And I was like, I would love to, but I don't know the first thing about podcasting. I don't know how you do one. I don't really have the time or the know-how to post them or edit them, or like, I don't know what you do. I just know tech videos. So Nick was like, I'll take care of it for you. I'll edit the shows and I'll find a way to post them so that people can listen to them in audio form. And all you would have to do is just come up with an hour or two per week for us to record. And I said, okay, well, I can probably find an hour or two to record once a week. And Nick was like, I'll be on the show with you. And that's how the Tailosive Tech podcast started. It was basically just me and Nick talking about news. And it was a lot more structured back then. They were like, okay, we got to talk about these things. Now we just kind of do whatever. But eventually Nick was posting all these podcasts, and I was telling people, hey, everyone, we have a podcast now. Feel free to check it out. And a lot of people were complaining about the audio, and they were like, this doesn't sound right, or you should change this or change this. And one of the people that was complaining or reaching out to reaching out to Nick was Randy. Randy was like, I'm an audio guy. I mix music, and I know how to balance audio and stuff. So I can help you edit the show so that the audio sounds better. And so Randy and Nick had already met each other, I think, through my channel. I don't think they knew each other before they were both watching Tailosive Tech. But eventually, after a few episodes of Randy doing the audio mixing, he was just like, Nick was just like, hey, I think at one point Nick said, I'm unavailable this week, but Randy's really nice and you could do a show with him. And I was like, okay, well, I knew who Randy was from the live chat. I'd seen him in a conversation and things. And I interacted with Randy on Twitter several times, but I'd never like sat down and FaceTime called him. So we were like, okay, let's do a show. So we sat down and recorded the show, and it went really well. So then that's how we kind of got the dynamic going of like, yeah, Randy and Nick and me have this kind of dynamic. And yeah, they were both fans beforehand. They both watched the videos before they became hosts of the show. So that's how we are now. Yeah, you can buy my friendship. Exactly. Okay, you Wilden Bro says, any tips on starting a tech channel? Well, all I can tell you is don't trust anybody. No, I'm probably a bad person to give advice because I haven't really grown my tech channel much in the past year. My tech channel has kind of sustained current audience amount, and other channels have blown past me in growth, but oftentimes doing things I don't really agree with. They're doing things that I don't think I would like as a viewer. But all I can recommend is just start making videos. Like, you're going to make bad videos when you first start out. Like, there's no way around it. Your first videos will be bad. You're not going to hear enough advice. You're not going to read enough information or hear the right things to the point that you're just going to start making videos and they're going to be great. Like, you're going to start and they're not going to be very good. And, the more you produce, the more practice you have at it, and look for room to improve. Like, okay, I tried this and that didn't really work. And don't necessarily copy your favorite channels, but look for themes and ideas, basically, of like, okay, what does this channel do that I like? You know, like, what I appreciate this aspect of the channel. Don't just be like, I like this channel, so I'm going to make all the exact same videos as him, and I'm going to do the exact same content. Like, no, just, you got to find a way to be unique and find your own voice. But simultaneously, find out, like, okay, my videos aren't performing as well as their videos. What are the differences? What are the reasons that they're getting more views and they're able to make a livelihood and I'm not? And just kind of see what should be prioritized. Like, is a MacBook Pro that helps me export videos faster really going to help me become a more successful channel, or is a better microphone with or a better lens or a better camera or better lighting going to make the bigger difference? I would say the logic is the magic of making quality content really does fall down to editing a lot of the time. It doesn't even really matter much what camera you're using, what mic you're using. As long as they're decent, I think you can do pretty amazing content on a phone as long as you're editing it right. Devanus, first link in the description to become a member. People are trying to buy my friendship. I think it's one of those things you had to get in on the ground floor of, because if there's people that approach me and say like, hey, we should, you could do this and I'll help you do this, then if I have the time for it, I'm typically pretty cooperative, but it's not as easy. It wasn't like Nick came to me and was just like, hey, let's be friends, I'll pay you. That's not what happened. Nick was like, I will, let's make a show because people like podcasts, and I know you don't have the time or know how to make the podcast happen, so let me do that for you, and you just got to find an hour, and we'll make content together. And I was like, okay, sounds good. But if someone approached me and just said, let's hang out and I'll pay you, I don't know, that I probably wouldn't be as into. Curbside says, I want to say I would have bought a 15-inch MacBook Air if it had the choice. Sometimes I feel like my current 13-inch isn't large enough. Yeah, that's I hear that a lot. I think a lot of people would go for it. Yeah, the naming scheme is strange, James. That's correct. We have the M1 Max. Mac Pro will get the M1 Pro Max. We'll see. Honestly, upgradability doesn't matter as long as Apple continues providing software support for a long time and doesn't pull the plug on any devices. Yeah, some people prefer having a device they can upgrade over time. Like my closest friend Ross is like that. I kept telling him, because his old iMac was not handling his red Komodo footage very well. And I was like, just get an M1 Mac Mini. They're really, really cheap. You can use your own monitor and keyboard, which he already had. I was like, just get a Mac Mini. It'll be totally worth it. And he was like, no, I can't upgrade it. I want something that I can swap out parts with and fix over time. So I know friends like that, but then there's people like me, usually people that are more into Apple, that are like, I don't need it to be upgradable. I'm just going to buy more computer than I think I need. I'm going to kind of over prepare with storage and CPU and GPU so that it does last me for a long time and I don't have to worry about ripping it open and replacing certain parts and all that. That's what I did with my iMac Pro. It was very overkill for my needs at the time, but here I am 4 years later and it still works great, and there's really nothing inherently wrong with it. I could probably keep using it for another year or two if I wanted. Tailosive is a made-up word I came up with as a kid, combining the words explosive and tail, because I was designing a rocket and I wanted to come up with a unique name for it, so I called it Tailosive. Then later when I was making a YouTube channel, it was like, come up with a unique name. So I was like, okay, I know that name's available. Okay, almost wrapped up here. Did it feel overwhelming to know that you had an audience when you reached a certain subscriber count? I'm asking because I just experiencing that recently. Oh, congratulations. That's awesome. Yeah, I don't think I would describe it as overwhelming, but it was certainly exciting. You know, I was definitely getting pumped, and it motivated me to start working harder when I knew that there was actually people watching. I know from experience, it's very, very difficult to make content when you don't have that many people interested in it. That's a good motivator. If you know making a video that people want to watch and people will seek out, that's like, okay, I want to make that. You don't want to really make a ton of stuff that no one wants to watch. That's harder to be motivated from. Maybe a modular Mac Pro with SoC module being the only thing upgradable. Even with a system on chip, I don't know. I have a hard time visualizing that. I am not an Android, no. Oh, man. Okay. We got one last super chat from Argos here to end the stream on. I got to get going. But he said, you're a very honest and respectful person is the reason I started watching your channel. Keep it up. Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate that. Sorry, the characters are all weird on the animation. But thank you, Argos. I appreciate the super chat. I don't plan on getting the new Pixel phones. Sorry, I'm just not reviewing Android this year, I guess. But I appreciate all the super chats and all your great questions today. I had a lot of fun. I'm convinced 15-inch MacBook Air needs to happen. Please, Apple, I hope you hear us. And I'll see you guys all soon. I'll be making more videos for you to watch tomorrow. Take care, all. Have a good day.